Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I will take a look at an article by Laurence BonJour called In Defense of the A Priori. And the title really says it all, right? BonJour is going to defend the a priori. In particular, he's going to defend the existence of a priori knowledge by defending the existence of a priori justification. So the idea is that some of the knowledge that we have has been justified or is justified not through anything empirical, not through any observations, anything that we got from the senses, but through rational a priori insight alone. And in fact, BonJour is going to argue that rational a priori insight plays a role even in most of the empirical knowledge that we have. Because he's going to argue that most of the empirical knowledge that we have, well, part of that, it's partly justified through what we got through the senses, but that alone wouldn't be enough. We also need to do some reasoning, for instance, and reasoning requires us to have a priori rational insights. So, BonJour believes both that there are claims that are purely justified on an a priori basis and that most empirical knowledge that we have has an a priori component in its justification. Well, in the book that I got this article from, which is the book Contemporary Debates in Epistemology, 2nd edition, BonJour's article is paired with an article by Michael Devitt. And this article by Michael Devitt is a reply to BonJour, and it's called There is no a priori. And that reply will be the subject of my next video. And so we will be able to see sort of these two opposed insights, an a priori philosopher, well, a philosopher who believes in a priori justification, and a philosopher who thinks that all justification is empirical, sort of confront each other here. But first, let us look at BonJour's article. So what BonJour is going to do is the following. First, he's going to explain a little bit more what he means when he says that there is a priori knowledge or a priori justification. Then he is going to give us some examples of what he thinks is, quite clearly things that we know that are not empirically justified, but justified a priori. And then he is going to engage more substantially, more substantively with the empiricist tradition. And he's going to argue that even the empiricist needs a priori justification. And he's going to argue that sort of empiricist alternatives to his own view don't really work, with Quine being a particular target. So let's see how that works out. In the section called The Nature of A Priori Reasons, BonJour sort of tells us what I've already told us when I introduced the topic. Right? So he tells us first that a priori reasons are sort of the opposite or opposed to empirical reasons. Right? If something is known a priori, that means that you don't know it based on the data that you got from sense experience. Now, BonJour, or really almost anyone who defends the possibility of or the actuality of a priori knowledge, is willing to claim that maybe we need sort of empirical stuff, that we need observations and sensations and so on and so forth to ever get these ideas, right? Suppose that I am a priori justified in certain mathematical knowledge that I have, then BonJour and almost everybody else would be willing to say, well, of course, you first needed to, hear people talk about mathematics. You needed to learn about that. So your senses were involved sort of in getting you to the point where you can think about, well, are there infinitely many prime numbers or not? But now your knowledge that there are infinitely many prime numbers, if you happen to have that knowledge, or let's say 2 plus 2 is 4, that's maybe a little bit more simple, that knowledge isn't empirical knowledge, right? Because the justification you have for it, the reasons you have for believing it, are not empirical. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. It's not so much a genetic question, like did we ever use our senses in getting these ideas or anything like that. It's a question about justification. Okay, so BonJour's claim is that certain knowledge, certain things that we know, the justification of that is based on a priori insight alone. So what is that kind of a priori insight? Well, here's what BonJour says about this. He says, it's the result of direct or immediate insight into the truth, indeed the necessary truth of the relevant claim. And he's not going to tell us that much more about a priori insight. It's just that you sort of have an immediate insight into the truth, or even into the necessary truth of the relevant claim. So you think about it and you just see, in a sense, that it's a necessary truth. One further important thing that BonJour adds to this, and it's important especially because he thinks that among the stuff that we have a priori insight into are the rules of reasoning, sort of the laws of logic. He tells us that these a priori reasons are not propositional in form. And he mentions Lewis Carroll and doesn't say very much more about it. But the basic idea is this. Suppose that I want to, I'm going to perform a certain piece of logical reasoning. Let's say I know A implies B, and now I'm going to perform the piece of logical reasoning that goes like this. Well, A implies B, therefore B. Well, that's a correct piece of reasoning, right? And BonJour would say that I have a priori insight into its correctness. But if my a priori insight into its correctness is an a priori insight into the truth of a proposition, namely the proposition if A and A implies B, then B, or something like that. If it's just insight into the truth of this proposition, well, then it seems that I need a further argument to apply this proposition to the original piece of reasoning and argue that, I can come to the conclusion B. Right? So I have A implies B. And now I have this piece of a priori insight that if A and A implies B, then B. And so I add that to my premises. And now I conclude B. But that's a new argument. And so I need a new piece of a priori insight to sort of know that that's correct. And this would lead to an infinite regress. So this idea has been made famous by in an article by Lewis Carroll on Achilles and the tortoise. And I actually have made a video about that. So if you are interested in exploring this further, you can check out that video about Lewis Carroll and Achilles and the tortoise. BonJour's solution is just to say that this a priori insight is not propositional in nature, right? What you see is that this piece of reasoning is good, right? That it's valid, that you can do it, and then you do it. Okay, but that's not the main point of the article. So what we get to next is a list of things that are supposed to be a priori pieces of knowledge. So let me read some of them out. 2 plus 3 is 5. All cubes have 12 edges. For any propositions P and Q, if it is true that P or Q and it is false that P, then it is true that Q. Or no surface can be uniformly red and uniformly blue at the same time. That seems kind of true. And BonJour goes on to say that he thinks that there are many more kinds of a priori knowledge, but they're a little bit more controversial. So he thinks that there are moral claims, metaphysical claims, maybe aesthetic claims. He doesn't mention it, but we could think that, and so on and so forth. But he's going to stick with sort of the simple, least controversial examples here. So we have truths like truths about mathematics, about figures in space, about reasoning, about one thing, it being impossible that one thing is completely red and completely blue at the same time, and so on and so forth. Okay. So given these examples, BonJour says it's just obvious that we don't need sort of empirical reasons to believe in them. Right? If I tell you that there are no things that are red entirely and blue entirely, and you say, well, I think we should go out in the world and check whether that's true, then I just think that you're not understanding what I'm saying. Right? If you were understanding what I'm saying, you would not believe that you needed to go out in the world to get empirical evidence of this. Okay. Now, BonJour, of course, is aware that empiricists, know about these kinds of examples and are still not convinced. And so BonJour is going to spend the rest of his article talking to or about empiricism, and trying to argue that the empiricist doesn't have a good alternative, and that in fact, in some sense, the empiricist requires a priori insights themselves. So here is the argument why empiricism requires a priori insight itself. Right, so we are supposing that observations, things that we get from the senses, can be reasons to believe in other ideas. Right, because most of the things that we know through the senses, presumably, it's not sort of a direct description of our experience. It's a kind of conclusion that we draw from it. Right? So to take a very simple example, we believe that that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, at least at normal pressures. Right? At normal pressure, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Okay. Maybe that's not a great example. Maybe that's the definition of Celsius. So let's say that it's we take some other. So let's take some kind of metal. Right, gold melts at a certain temperature. I'm not sure about it, but we're going to call it T. Gold melts at temperature T. Okay, that's an empirical claim, and presumably we know it. Right, we've done lots of experiments. We've tried it with different samples of gold. We've sort of made sure that those samples of gold were pure. There were no other metals sort of mixed in with it. We did this experiment a lot of times, and finally we concluded, well, gold just melts at this temperature. Okay. So what we have done in that kind of case, BonJour would say, is we have taken a whole bunch of experiences and we've drawn a conclusion from it. Right? And that is, of course, a very normal thing that we do in trying to get knowledge of the empirical world. We have all kinds of data, all kinds of observations, and we draw a conclusion from it. And so we get empirical knowledge about the world that goes beyond our immediate experiences. And that's good, right? Without that, everything would be, we would know almost nothing about the world if we couldn't go beyond our immediate experiences. But that's only justified, BonJour says, that's only justified if that conclusion actually follows from the observations, right? If it is okay, if it is all right, if it is rational to draw this conclusion from those observations. So I have all the observations, and in addition I need, well, with those observations, it's rational to draw this conclusion, and then I know the conclusion, right? But this second thing, right, not the observations, but this insight that it's rational to draw this conclusion, where does that come from? Is that itself an empirical insight? Well, says BonJour, that can't really be the case. Right? I mean, we need these kinds of insights to draw any conclusions at all from experience. And so those insights can't themselves come from experience. Right? They're not themselves empirical. We are not doing observations to see whether our observations lead to these conclusions, and if we tried to do that, we would get into an infinite regress or a circle or something that's bad. And so the insight into that, into this kind of reasoning, the insight that this kind of reasoning is good, that must be an a priori insight. And so BonJour says, anyone who believes in empirical knowledge that goes beyond the immediate impressions of the senses has to rely on certain kinds of inference, certain kinds of reasoning. But the insight that those kinds of inference or reasoning are good, well, that must be an a priori insight. That can't itself, in turn, also be an empirical fact. And indeed, BonJour goes on and he says, I think this is true for all kinds of reasoning. Right? Any kind of reasoning, you need an a priori insight that it's good. And so if we ditch the a priori, then we ditch reasoning altogether, and there's nothing left that could be called a human mind or human thinking. Okay, so that's a strong claim, right? Without a priori insight, there's really nothing. In particular, there's not empirical reasoning. Now, In the last pages of his article, BonJour talks about two kinds of empiricism. And the kinds of strategies that they use to disarm the a priori, so to speak. So the first thing he talks about is moderate empiricism. And his moderate empiricist is somebody who tries to, save the a priori by giving it a definition that turns it into something that is acceptable to the empiricist. And so one type of moderate empiricist might say something like this: well, a priori truths are just things that are true because you can reduce them to the laws of logic, right? So if we take something like, this is this standard philosophical example from Quine: all bachelors are unmarried. That, if we use the standard English definition of a bachelor, it's a little bit of an old-fashioned word nowadays. It would be something like an unmarried man. And so we have all unmarried men are unmarried. Okay. And that is supposed to reduce to the logical truth that all A's are A's, or something like that. Or that if something has A and B, it has A, some kind of logical rule. Well, BonJour says that doesn't really work. Right? That doesn't work because you're still presupposing that you have these logical truths, these logical rules, and you need a priori insight for that. So this is, this doesn't get rid of a priori knowledge. And he says, well, there's really no sort of moderate sense here in which you could get rid of a priori knowledge. And so he talks about radical empiricism, and his figurehead for radical empiricism is Quine, and in particular it's the Quine of two dogmas of empiricism, which I also happen to have a video about. I think I'm getting to the point where I have so many videos that, I stumble across references to things that I already did a video about in new articles. Okay, so you can watch the video on Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism if you want to. It's a very famous article. And in it, Quine claims that all our beliefs are justified sort of as a whole, sort of holistically, by experience. So we have all these beliefs and they all fit together in a sort of web. And when we have experiences that don't fit our beliefs, we need to change something in the web, somewhere, in order to make the web fit experience again. And there are many ways to do that, according to Quine, right? Sometimes we can just change something which we tend to think of as empirical, but we can also change things that we tend to think of as a priori. Because even the laws of logic or the laws of mathematics or whatever, they're up for grabs. And it might be hard to sort of give an example of that, but, I suppose that, take 2 + 2 is 4. Right? If we find out, sort of in dealing with the empirical world, that if we add 2 things to 2 things, we always end up with 3 things. Maybe there's something going on in the empirical world that makes that happen. Then we might want to say, 2 + 2 is 3. Right, and change our mathematics. I think the idea is something like that, although Quine doesn't really give very concrete examples of how this would work. And so the idea is that, the only thing really that justifies a belief is its fit with this holistic web that is tested only as a whole by experience. And that means that the same criterion, fit in the web, is used both for empirical and for a priori ideas, right? And so there's no real distinction. And so the distinction that I just made between the empirical and the a priori is suspect and maybe needs to be abandoned. Well, BonJour has 2 problems with Quine. His first problem is he says, even if this entire story is true, that there is this holistic web of belief and that everything hangs together, we still might have a priori rational insight into some of these truths. And that would be a reason for keeping them, right? We just see that 2 + 2 is 4, that it's necessary that 2 + 2 is 4, and that's why we keep it. And we would, change our empirical theory and not our a priori theory. So Quine doesn't really argue against that. But I think more importantly, BonJour is going to say, I mean, this entire idea of sort of coherence of the web, you know, the idea that all these thoughts hang together, well, that requires that these thoughts are logically related to each other. Right? It requires that, you know, these ideas over here and these ideas over there together imply those ideas over there, right? That's what makes them hang together. And so we need these links, right? This idea of coherence requires sort of rational rules for linking thoughts together. And those can't themselves be part of the web of belief in the same way. I mean, this is the a priori insights that we need to even conceive of a web of belief. Or, to put it all more succinctly, as BonJour himself does, he says, well, you know, just take this idea that fitting in a coherent web is what you need to be true, right? That's a sign of truth. Well, if that's true, right, if fitting into a coherent web that answers to experience is a reason to believe that something is true, what's the status of that claim? Right, that can't be a further empirical thing in the web. This must at least be an a priori insight. And so again, empiricism requires the a priori. So that's BonJour's article. I think it's very succinct, but also really quite powerful. Gets some of the most interesting ideas for the defenders of a priori on the table. And so it will be very interesting to see in our next video how Empirical Devitt is going to reply to this.